of their race, they automatically will be mistreated across those systems. This could be education, healthcare, criminal justice, housing, banking, economics, language, technology, media representation, ideology, and so on. If we don't interrupt the systems we live in, then we're complicit in them, says D'Angelo. In that way, we can say that nice white people who do nothing further to challenge racism are racist. Next slide, please. So, humility is key. You can't know all you need to know. The social contract underwriting all other social contracts in the Western world is white supremacy, says D'Angelo. But it is rarely, if ever, discussed in mainstream education. You can be seen as qualified to lead thousands of people in an organization that professes to value diversity, and you won't even have been asked if you can engage in these issues with any skill during the hiring process. Next slide, please. If you feel overwhelmed about where to start, take out a piece of paper and jot down why you don't know what to do or how to get started. D'Angelo says she's often asked by other white people, "What do I do?" She advises, make a list of why you don't know what to do. Maybe you never talk about racism with your white friends. Maybe you never talk about racism with your Black, Indigenous, or friends of color. Maybe you don't have any Black, Indigenous, or friends of color. Maybe you haven't cared enough to find out before now. Whatever's on your list, let it guide you. Addressing the reasons you've observed won't be quick and easy, but you can start educating yourself today. Google is your friend. So many Black people are publishing and putting out really excellent lists of resources. We have to break with the apathy and seek those out. Next slide. So before we move on, I'd love for people to maybe share in the comments if they've ever experienced microaggressions themselves as we continue with this conversation so that we can create a little dialogue on the side. As I move on to grind culture, I want to explore what we call workaholic, grind, hustle culture through the lens of the following 3 articles on the subject. Next slide, please, Kenny. Commentary on America's Anti-Vacation Workaholic Streak Goes Back Centuries by Stephen Mim in the Post and Courier. When the Hustle Isn't Enough by NPR's Isabella Rosario. How to Challenge White Supremacy Through Rest by Natalie Bui, Velin Mojarro, Kausar Mohammed from Shift. So first of all, workaholic culture history. The rise of Puritan Protestantism in the 1500s happened during the Reformation. Religious prosecution led to widespread immigration to the Americas in the 1600s, especially to what is now the US. I want to take a pause at that bullet point and expand on Barbara Goodrich's work on Protestant and Calvinist work ethic. The Reformation, the rise of Protestantism against the Roman Catholic Church in Europe with reformers such as Luther and Calvin, occurred at the same time as a major economic shift in Europe. The old powers to be, the old ruling class, the aristocrats, had claimed that their wealth and power over others were justified by God's having ordained it via a natural hierarchy. But through the Renaissance and Enlightenment, they'd been losing wealth and power to the rising wealth merchant families, who had originally been mere middle-class commoners. This same rising middle class later grew into industrialists and financiers when the Industrial Revolution permitted that. Now these new wealthy commoners are becoming the new ruling class, competing with aristocrats. They, of course, are attracted to the Protestant Calvinist work ethic because according to it, their new wealth and power over others are justified by God's ordaining it because they appear to be at the elect of God's chosen few. Max Weber hypothesized that this workaholism came from one particular kind of Puritan Protestant religion, the kind that holds that God has already predetermined which of us will be saved and which damned before we are ever conceived and born. John Calvin is a prime example of such a predestination theologian. Hence, Weber coined the term Protestant work ethic, or sometimes referred to as Calvinist work ethic. So back to the bullet points, another commentary by Stephen Mihm, specifically in the article, is in the 1610s, Captain John Smith surveyed the New England coast, became convinced that settlers could make a life there while only working 3 days a week. This was rather rich, coming from a man who had ruled the early Virginia settlement in Jamestown while proclaiming, "He that will not work shall not eat." And then furthermore, we acknowledge the fact that Native Americans at the time were viewed as savages and less than. They were pillaged and wiped out in order to take over valued land with potential for profit. Africans were enslaved since they were not seen as human, brought in to perform work for those interested, again, in profit. Next slide, please. So how does that lead into today? Now we see that the U.S. labor force fails to spend the vacation days due to them. U.S. workers average more hours a year than every other nation in the world. When it comes to working ourselves to death, we are still on top. The U.S. is the most overworked developed nation in the world. At least 134 countries have laws setting the maximum length of the work week. The U.S. does not. In the U.S., 85% of males and 66% of females work more than 40 hours per week. Next slide, please. So let's look at this graph, and I would like to preface this, first of all, by acknowledging and being very grateful that Palladium is an employer that allows us way more vacation time than is and leave time than is displayed on this graph. So I wanted to make sure to point that out. However, that's not the reality for everyone. If you look here and you compare to other countries that are considered Western or Westernized, we are very much at the bottom. Unlike most of the European Union, the United States has no federal law requiring private companies to pay for national holiday time off. And just on a personal note, in my time studying abroad in France, I was very surprised to see that Europeans consider us as workaholic. We very much are known for that, and I found it ironic because it's Europeans in Europe telling me, you know, this is something that they perceive and know that is part of our culture. Next slide, please. So going into hustle culture, as hustle relating to grinding. So hustle culture says it's fashionable to work yourself to death, or at least look like you are. Hustle has been co-opted to describe an empowering, even lucrative project that someone takes on outside of their day job. Historically, hustle, or lack thereof, was invoked to make an association between blackness and laziness. The average colored, quote, "The average colored man does not know how to hustle," End of quote. Timothy Thomas Fortune wrote for the Southwestern Christian Advocate, a Methodist African-American newspaper, in 1888. So the article, When the Hustle Isn't Enough, by NPR's Isabella Rosario. I loved a lot of what she said, was I think great to share with all of you. This idea that Black people struggle due to their own failures rather than systemic oppression was widespread in history. As the U.S. underwent rapid economic growth during the Gilded Age, Black Americans had to hustle against the forces of redlining, school segregation, employment, discrimination, and white supremacist violence. Some held on to hope that by working twice as hard, they might be able to get by, or even in some cases, get ahead. Black rappers made hustling mainstream, weaving it into a narrative about Black resilience and self-empowerment. I don't know if all of you know the song by Jay-Z, Hustler. But importantly, their lyrics acknowledged that hustling was what Black people needed to do this to survive in a rigged system. The problem is hustling still isn't a choice for people who aren't at the top. There's a world of difference between staying late at the office to score a promotion and being forced to pee in a bottle to keep your job at an Amazon warehouse. Everyone is hustling, but everyone cannot hustle the same. Next slide, please. So moving on to the final article, How to Challenge White Supremacy Through Rest. Encourage individuals to unpack ways that rest can be a form of resistance in an ethnocentric culture. Ibram X. Kendi writes in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, quote, "The origins of racism cannot be separated from the origins of capitalism. The life of capitalism cannot be separated from the life of racism. Our country was founded on the basis of capitalism, and this desire to conquer and gain more utilized racialized slavery as the means to the end. Ethnocentric work culture is made up of normalized characteristics that merit our proximity to whiteness. It is all the subtle and coded ways our work elevates whiteness as more professional or respectable. It allows racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, and white supremacy to further escalate. We have to name this work culture for what it is, ethnocentric work culture, recognizing that what our culture inherently is the first step to challenging it and resisting it, which then in turn can allow us to reimagine a culture that better serves everyone or all."
So I want to hear for just a second and just engage the group really quickly. Based on sort of what we're talking about right now in the hustle culture, and I know we in particularly as a group are very much not a 40-hour a week work people. We are very much hard workers and pushing through. How do we think, if at all, our personal grind culture is affecting, say, the person who is working in a warehouse for Amazon? Do you think that we're setting a tone, working from the corporate end for people who are working different types of jobs? I just wanted to see if people had thoughts on that, ideas. If you've worked in a place before who wasn't as forthcoming about wanting us to use our vacation days. I know Palladium is very, very big about using your vacation and taking the time, and work-life balance is a huge portion of the conversation here at Palladium. Have you been in a workplace before where that wasn't part of the conversation? How did that make you feel, and how did it push you in ways that you didn't necessarily want to be pushed?
Thank you, Kenny. Next slide, please. So, ways in which we see an ethnocentric work culture. Here we have a table that was created by Shift, the three authors part of an organization called Shift that created this table based on what they thought was what represented ethnocentric work culture. First of all, being perfectionism, no room for failure, either or thinking, deficit mindset, only one right way to do things. An example could be either or thinking shows up in colonization and how people who lived life any other way other than the Eurocentric way were thought to be barbaric. Concentration of power, power hoarding, leadership worship, defensiveness, justification of abuses of power in order to maintain power. An example would be corporate top-down decision-making, creating a lack of transparency and in return more secrecy. Right to comfort, entitlement, fear of open conflict, poor conflict management, prioritizing logic over emotions, fragility. Example, the lack of ability to discuss race because it makes people uncomfortable, and the perpetuation of a colorblind society. Individualism, taking space instead of making space, poor work delegation, bearing the sole responsibility, being competitive versus cooperative, bootstrap narrative. An example, the idea that an individual's success, power, and wealth is solely based on their hard work disregards how systemic issues regarding race, class, gender, etc. impact economic mobility. And finally, progress is more better, valuing growth over sustainability, prioritizing data and numbers over qualitative relationships, creating a false sense of urgency, accumulation is worth, product over process. An example being the assembly line model introduced for mass manufacturing in the early 1900s, deemed human labor as impersonal, replaceable, and efficient. If you look at the internalizing ethnocentric work culture triangle, you see at the very bottom is the bootstrap theory, business as a badge of honor, hustle culture or grind culture, workaholic culture, we've used all three terms, violent communication, sleep when I'm dead. In the middle, we see inability to switch off, feelings of unworthiness that are caused by everything at the bottom, productivity as worth, burnout, loss of sleep, deprioritization of personal relationships, obsessive perfectionism, forgetting to eat meals. And at the top of that is loss of humanity, physical and mental illness. And I would like to point out the psychological impacts of having to deal with racism on the daily, inside, outside of work, carrying that baggage even though you don't want to, feeling guilty because, you know, this is my fault. I'm carrying this burden because of my own shortcomings, because my family comes from a different socioeconomic background. I mean, the list is endless of how this can have psychological impacts. Next slide, please. So a couple of quotes that I really loved. Rest is a form of resistance because it disrupts and pushes back against capitalism and white supremacy. The NAP Ministry, great organization. If you are on Instagram, I encourage you to follow at the NAP Ministry on Instagram. They examine the liberating power of naps. We believe rest is a form of resistance and reparations. They very much focus on Black liberation and Black plight. I encourage you to look at them. Another great quote by Audre Lorde: caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. With an understanding of ethnocentric ethnocentric work culture, we must ask ourselves, what would our movement and our work culture look like if we centered rest? What would it look like if we centered rest for ourselves, for each other, and in our institutions? For example, what would you add to this diagram that we see here? Circle around the center is, the very center of it is rest, and that is at the self level. It could mean establishing boundaries, saying no more often, not missing meals, dancing, cleaning, cooking, allowing for needed sleep, etc. Rest at the collective level, which is the next step, could mean 4-day work weeks, communal childcare, setting clear work-life boundaries, intergenerational support, grassroots decision-making. And then on the outside, rest at the institutional level could mean paid family and sick leave for all, universal health care that isn't tied to employment, universal basic income, raising minimum wage, reparations, etc. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to leave you with one back, please. One more. Thank you. I want to leave you to ponder a question. What leads you to want to constantly grind or hustle? Is it guilt because you fear being perceived as someone who doesn't work enough? Is it internalized anxiety that you won't get ahead unless you work yourself to death? Is it some subconscious fear of facing certain feelings, thoughts, or realities in your own life, of the people around you and of your community because it makes you feel bad or negative? Is it out of necessity because the job you have isn't paying you enough to sustain yourself? Are you working extra hours because there are not enough people or systems to do all of the work required? A pause there. I know for example, acknowledge I personally work 3 gigs outside of my full-time job just so that I can try to make a dent in my student loans. And I keep that in mind. You know, what if other people have quite a lot of things outside of their home work life that's occurring? Is it they're the first who went to college? Are their family depending on them because they're the first who have a corporate job? Things to keep in mind. A couple other things to keep in mind: working more than 40 hours without overtime pay or comping hours could be taking away a job opportunity from someone who could do the extra work you and your team are doing. Keep that in mind. Are you working those extra hours and, you know, not realizing that that could be an opportunity for someone else, especially someone who needs a job? Having the time to rest allows room for reflection and therefore an ability to increase mindfulness. I think about, especially during this pandemic, there's certainly a reason that this pandemic has served as a great pause, like an awakening for so many people who aren't spending the majority of their time commuting to work nowadays. Maybe they've been laid off, or perhaps a lot less time working in general because we're all working from home. This time has allowed for deep reflection. And so I want you to keep that in mind. Would we have had this deep reflection as a nation, as a society, as a company even, had we not had this opportunity to really think about what's been going on in our society? Therefore, it is possible to see how workaholic culture creates a distraction from what is really happening in the world and in our communities, from acknowledging our own personal mental health needs and overall having the time to work on improving ourselves and our society. So I think a question that I would like to ask all of you, other than all these questions, is also how do you think that grind culture or a fast-paced workaholic culture might deter marginalized groups like Black, Indigenous, or people of color from being able to fully perform in this kind of environment. Thank you so much. I revert back to Kenny.
Awesome. Thank you, Isla. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you for to you and Nicole for all the time that you guys have put into putting this together. I have been monitoring the chat as we've been going through this, and there's some really interesting things going on. I'm seeing a lot of words like sacrifice, go above and beyond, things like that. I want to encourage if you have something you want to put out to the group. Obviously, we don't want to talk over each other, so if you want to raise your hand, I can call on you and we can sort of start a discussion this way. I think what's going on in the chat is just absolutely an incredible look at sort of how we've internalized this type of work and sort of the things that Ale was going over in a way that is just really interesting. And I think to talk about, I think there's a lot of things being talked about in the chat about wage workers and how more time means more money because they're not being paid a livable wage. Do we think that grind culture contributes to that? If I can pay less money to get the same amount of work done, then I'm going to do that as a business owner as opposed to paying more money to get the same amount of work done. So how do we see this this adherence to the hustle culture? How do we see that trickling down to people who may be more marginalized than the people on this call or the people in Palladium? Because again, we're in a place where we've, in our careers where we've built the ability to have a salary job. And with that, how is having a salary job contribute to that hustle culture as well? So if anybody has any thoughts, go ahead and raise your hand and I can unmute you. You don't have to open your camera. If you don't want to, you're more than welcome to if you want. Brianna, let's hear what you have to say. I think you might still be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I'll speak to something that was said about taking on multiple jobs to pay student loans. So for me, going to college was breaking out of poverty. And so I had to take the student loan to go to college. I get my job and it doesn't pay me enough to pay for the student loan. And so I feel like I have to freelance, especially early in my career, the days where they wanted you to have 5 years experience to be an entry-level person. And so it caused me to want to stay at work late just to get noticed or not complain when there were certain microaggressions going on because I needed to keep this job. And so I had to overlook certain things that were going on. So I think we definitely need a challenge as a country. We're trying to make these moves for minorities to move up, and then they get into these systems where you perpetuate different forms of racism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really great point to bring up, this idea that it's even hard for us, on top of as part of this hustle culture, it's hard for us as people of color to speak up and speak out again about things that are happening to us that may be, racist, that may be offensive, because it's like, well, I'm here, I've made it this far, I have to continue just to put my head down. Like, I remember growing up, the phrase was always just keep your head down and keep moving. And that is far too often the narrative that we have to sort of create for ourselves in the workplace in order to just maintain status quo. So I think that's a really great point. Do you want to follow up, or is there anybody else who has any thoughts on that? Thank you for sharing, Brianna. Great. Oh, I see Susan. I'm gonna go ahead and open your mic, Susan. Let's hear what you have to say.
Hey, Kenneth. I was reflecting on your comment about keep your head down, because my first job out of college, I got tuition remission working in a university. And I can remember with myself and several of my coworkers who were all white, we were in a department that, depending upon what shift you worked, it either went from you had a token white person on the shift, or you might have had a token black person on your shift. And other 20-somethings and we were impassioned. We were like, we want to change this. We want to fix this. We want to do this. And our supervisor, who was black, would always be telling us, no, just put your 8 hours in, put your head down, do your work, go home. And, our white privilege at the time, we're working a day shift and we're smile and wave to everybody. We wanted to challenge the system. We wanted to attack, but these other people didn't have that ability. And it used to just rankle me. I was like, why? Why wouldn't? Well, you don't rock the boat. You have a job. You keep your job. You stay employed. You don't call attention to yourself. And, it's a freedom I've had. Like, I have the freedom to be like, yeah, I don't see a hustle culture where I work because I'm in a secure place. My student loans are well paid off. They're way in the back. And I'm much more comfortable. So I might not even notice that, there's a hustle culture. I'm always surprised when Brianna says, I'm running 15 minutes late. I'm like, why should she have to do that? Why should she have to tell us if she's just going to be 15 minutes late, But she does. She has to. Right. Rambling. I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Susan. I think that's a really, it's exactly why we have to have conversations like this, right? Because if you're in a position where you don't see what's happening around you, or the way that you perceive it is different than what the reality is, how can you be proactive in helping? And I think your anecdote is really powerful, and thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Does anybody else have anything to add? I'm seeing a lot in the chat. If you put something in the chat already that hasn't gone responded to, or that you'd like to elaborate on, go ahead and speak up. We'd love to hear from you. You shouldn't feel like you need to, obviously, but if you'd like to, we'd love to hear from you. Great. So I'm seeing a little bit, so I'm just going to start pulling stuff out of the chat. If you guys have any thoughts on it, please speak up. Oh, Ryan, I see your hand. Go ahead and open your mic, Ryan.
Oh, shoot. No, I just really appreciate the conversation so far. And what's really been interesting about the whole conversation is I never necessarily connected it to the perpetuation of white supremacy either, and how we internalize these systemic forms of white supremacy through our work itself and our cultural behaviors. And it's just been a fascinating, eye-opening presentation to just step back and think about all of the different rationales and reasons that go into perpetuating some of these issues that I think a lot of us face, but clearly a lot of us face in very different ways. I remember starting off as an intern here in DC 8 years ago, and just the cost of living alone here in DC really I struggled with, to the point where I really got into some sorry to be so disclosing, but to some bad debt, because I was trying to survive in DC while also being at my dream job. And I'm thankful that I finally got to a place where I don't have to worry about that as much, but it's still one of those things where so many people in DC, we have a movement on Capitol Hill to actually pay interns to live in this incredibly expensive city, so just a lot of things are going through my head right now, and I really appreciate the presentation. Thank you. Absolutely. And thank you for all the people commenting online. I'm really appreciating all your comments as well, especially Ashley's latest comment on exporting some of this around the world too. Thank you. Yeah,
thank you, Ryan. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's also an important point about how hustle culture and just ethnocentrism generally just sort of trickles down through pretty much everything. Internships is a great example of how ethnocentrism and, for lack of a better word, white supremacy sort of gets down to all of us. A lot of people of color and a lot of people who are marginalized in any way have a huge problem working internships because they can't, they don't have the family backing to actually do the internship, to work for free. And as we all know, as people who work in DC or have worked in DC or work with people in DC, a huge door opener for you is an internship. And if you have an internship, as Brianna was saying, if you don't have 5 years of experience, it's hard to get that that first year position. So it's a really great thing to think about as we talk about these things and as we work through not just this month. I know there's a lot of conversations that are coming up, but as we work through just moving forward in our intentiveness on being anti-racist. I have Amanda with your hand up.
Hey there.
Hey.
I know that the meeting chats are pretty rapid fire here, so I just wanted to quickly send out a verbal flag that if anybody's interested in just a really casual chat, if you're a supervisor and you just want to have a chat or continue the conversation about if we've inadvertently kind of perpetuated some of this hustle and grind culture, just feel free to ping me separately, and I'd be happy to schedule that. Just we can have our lunches and just have a free form chat. Yeah, so you all know where to find me on Teams. But that's it.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Please take advantage of that, guys. Like, these conversations need to happen, and they can't just happen every time we gather 67 plus people on a BBL. It needs to happen privately and in situations where you feel comfortable to talk about some really uncomfortable things. This is a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of people to engage in and to hear. I'll tell you, putting this together, it was an uncomfortable thing for us to actually put to paper, and Ala did a really incredible job at creating a huge portion of this presentation, and this is a really hard conversation to have. So please take advantage of those one-on-one, two-on-one conversations if you can. I also just want to quickly point out that Palladium is one of a few DC companies that does pay its interns, which is absolutely incredible and something we should absolutely be proud of. And then I have a couple of hands up. I just also want to be mindful of time. We have about 10 minutes. So if you have anything you want to say, if you want to add anything, please do. But I just want to be mindful of that. We will continue this conversation on Yammer. Afterward, we have some links that we're going to post and move forward from there. But I'm going to go ahead and Otavia.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to add regarding, the concepts of hustle and grind, that I think it relates to diversity and inclusion in the company as a whole, and specifically D&I and senior leadership, because I think that an interesting angle that I've been thinking about lately is, what are people's motivation to go above and beyond? And I think a factor of that is, do I see people that look like me, that are from, my cultural background in senior leadership, that, kind of motivates me and makes me believe that I can get there as well, versus if I don't see that, that's a demotivating factor.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great thing to bring up. If you're not seeing yourself reflected in your managers and the people that you aspire to be, then it's a red flag in your mind to say, like, okay, well, they're not promoting people that look like me, right? So I think that's a great That's a great point. Thanks, Octavia. Ryan, I see your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to bring us back to also some of the things we talked about at the beginning around microaggressions. I just was wondering if you might go in a little bit more about kind of, you know, not only what they are, but how does one like overcome them in terms of how do you check yourself in the event that you're doing it? You know, like what are some tips and tricks to do better, I guess you could say.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Does anybody have any ideas on that? If you do, please raise your hand. And I'm sure probably everyone, if not everyone on this chat, most people on this chat have experienced microaggressions. Microaggressions are pervasive, and as Ryan said, it's pervasive because a lot of times the person who's doing it doesn't understand that they're doing it, which is a problem. I think just a big portion of this is just engaging in conversation, just like, you know, educating yourself. You don't know what you don't know. And if you can take the time to educate yourself and to build just a knowledge of how other people feel and how comments you make might make other people feel, that's important. And, you know, engaging with people of color and asking tough questions and having uncomfortable conversations with people that you know and trust is a great start. I know I've been, you know, as a person of color, I've been engaged in conversations with friends of mine lately who are white, who just want to understand where we're coming from, and I think that's a good first step. It was meaningful to me. Amanda, I see your hand up. Is it still up from before? Oh, nope.
Sorry about that.
No
worries.
Just
from before.
No worries, no worries. Well, do we have any other thoughts? Again, I'm seeing a lot of chatter in the chat. Sorry, it's really hard for me to like go back and forth. But does anybody else want to speak up? I have Liz.
Sure. Thanks so much for engaging us in this conversation. It's clear we all have a lot to say about this, and a lot of you know, a lot of we're indicating what a lot of the challenges are. And I guess I would just encourage us to keep the conversation going, to think about the solutions, right? Because, you know, I think we have a unique time to be thinking about it with our newfound D&I lens. You know, also COVID has put a lot of different stressors on us as well. And I think, you know, we really need to be thinking about, from the top down and from the bottom up, what we can do about this. So, you know, I think I just encourage us to keep this as the start of a conversation. Maybe there's a way that, you know, the working group on race or our culture committee can like comb through what people have wrote about in the chat and bring these up to really have sort of more tangible solutions around this, right? And a more, you know, concerted effort in how do we address this, because, you know, it's definitely something that exists within our just American culture, but I think within international development, there's another lens to this that, you know, is especially unique and pervasive. And so, you know, I hope that we can be thinking both from the top down and from the bottom up on really what some of the solutions will be, because ultimately this affects our business and our bottom line, right? And the mental health and the burnout, you know, is real. And it also impacts the way that we're able to bring in different voices and all of that. So just a call to action that, you know, I think we need to keep this going and keep thinking of solutions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Liz. I completely agree. And I think that's such an important point to make, that this is the start of a conversation. And this is something, I know we're talking a lot about a lot of negatives and just sharing experiences right now, but you know, the next step in this is to identify how we make this better. And if it's something that you can be doing as an individual, or if it's something that we need leadership to do, we need to hear that. We need to really think about these solutions in order to help not just ourselves, but to help people around us, because again, not everyone's going to be able to speak up, and how is what we do in our corporate position going to help those of our colleagues in the field, or beyond that in other types of work that don't have the ability to work in the same way that we work. With that, we're hitting the 1 hour mark on my recording, so I don't want to take.
I know Nicole had her hand up.
Oh,
I think
great.
Nicole has. And
I wanted to note that the Working Group on Racism in America does have a subcommittee working on HR issues, and I think this is certainly an issue that could be tied into those discussions, as well as our office culture discussions. And there's a committee working on issues around that as well. So I think that that I completely back you up on that, Liz and Kenny, that we think about action. One point to make that I saw in the chat earlier is that, at least for those of us who do bill partially or fully to projects, by working overtime consistently, we're actually taking funds from the company. If we're overbilling our hours to projects, we're taking a job that could be held by someone else and generate more revenue for the company. So there are financial incentives or financial arguments to be made on this as well.
Great, thank you, Nicole. That's an absolutely important point to make. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that anybody would like to bring up before we close this out?
Kenny, this is Ryan, and I'm sorry I don't mean to interrupt, but I do want to just link this. First off, I want to thank you, Ale and Nicole, for organizing this incredible conversation. I really hope everyone on this call really sees that this is an incredible opportunity being presented to us right now to actually have dialogue that we actually, as a cohort, really haven't had the chance to really talk about. And yet it's really opening up conversations about things that I think a lot of us care about, and ways to actually improve the way we do our work. And it has a social justice bent to it as well. I wanted to remind everyone that this is part of the conversation, this presentation, and the next month of activities that we actually have planned to actually continue talking about this important space, and most importantly, Liz, to identify solutions along the way. I would say that the Working Group on Racism is leveraging this month to really draw from all the incredible comments you've already provided in the chat and throughout the next week to really help us build some of our recommendations that will be moving forward. And I'd like to invite all of you to continue this conversation, to contribute to the articles that we'll be sharing all month long on the America's Yammer page, as well as attend the future activities we'll be planning. Next week is all about how do we communicate and tell stories around that challenge the norms and expectations that we sometimes fall through. So Brianna Pullen has organized an incredible week to talk about that. The following week we'll be talking about decolonizing the field of development, and we actually have an incredible speaker, Stephanie Camus, coming in to talk with us, and even more to come after that. So please make sure you pay attention to what's going on this month, and most importantly, contribute and activate those brain cells, because you all are doing it right now, and it's incredible. So thank you again to Ale, Kenny, and Nicole for your incredible presentation. So back to you, Kenny. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. No worries. Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate that. Just to close out this conversation, well, not to close out the conversation, but to close out this chat. I just want to say thank you to all of you who have shared your stories, shared your thoughts. This is not the end of a conversation. Like Liz said, like Liz and Ryan said, this is the beginning of a conversation. Let's take this to Yammer and really think about the way that we're communicating here is really powerful. And if you feel inclined, let's continue the conversation there, because this is just the beginning. This is just an opener. This is the start of a dialogue. Thank you to Ale and Nicole for your support and help in putting this together, and all the hard work that you've done for this. We really appreciate your voices. We appreciate your thoughts, and we're going to go ahead and move this to Yammer. So this is being recorded, so I'm not sure what the mechanism of getting this out is, but we will be getting out the presentation itself.
Kenny, hi, this is Roland. I just wanted to first of all give you and Ali and Nicole a huge shout out, not only for the great work that went into putting together the presentation, but in presenting it. I'm equally thrilled, if not even more thrilled, that there are 90+ people that have not only kind of dialed in, but clearly are grappling with this very difficult subject. I think it's a super way to get our month going, but as I've continually said, as we've been working through the working group, these are conversations and actions that are long term. So it's great to see this energy around this. Like I said, really kudos to you guys for putting this on and getting us off to a great start for August. I would say there's some questions here about how do we continue the dialogue, as Kenny has said, as others of us from the working group have said. In some ways, you need to take this back to your own sort of groups of 2 or 3 or 30, whatever it is that you're comfortable with. I will say just 2 things before I hand it back to Kenny to really close out is that one, we are closing in on contracting an anti-racism consultant who should be starting with us relatively shortly. And so we will be having some professional expert guidance on this. I mean, it's great that Kenny and Ali and Nicole have put this together and, are speaking eloquently to these issues, as are other people, but there are people who are, like I said, have PhDs in this, who do this every day, who have all kinds of tools and resources. And so we're going to start bringing that to all of you and all of our colleagues here. So in addition to these sort of, if you will, homegrown products, we are bringing in some experts, like I said, the first of whom will be an anti-racism consultant whom we hope to start in the next couple weeks, I'll just say. The other thing I wanted to note, and this is partially to answer the question about, well, how do we continue having these conversations? We have designated liaisons from the working group to the various kind of operating entities within Palladium. So there are a couple of people for health. There's Otavia is, and I don't have all the names in front of me, and I can't remember all of them, but we do have, like I said, liaisons who will be reaching out to, if they've not already, the individual operating groups to really facilitate communication between the working group and our various operating groups to make sure that you're hooked into the resources and the conversations that are going on. So, like I said, super job, and I'll hand it back to you guys to close out.
Great, thanks so much. And if you have any questions or thoughts, please feel free to reach out to the working group. The email has been provided, and if you will go ahead and put that on in the information that we put out on Yammer later this week as well. So again, thank you so much for attending. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen, to think, to speak out, and to engage with your colleagues. We really, really appreciate it. And thanks, guys. Have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.